In 1925, a good steel trap cost a quarter, and a winter's fur check could carry a family clear to spring. The men who ran the trap lines knew tools that have vanished from every hardware store in America. Number 6 was so deadly that states began writing laws against it. And number 1 built a fortune strange enough to sound made up. These 15 forgotten tools kept the American woodsman alive, and most folks today have never held one. Hit subscribe and let's count them down. Let's begin our countdown with number 15. Number 15, the dirt sifter, was the humblest tool on the whole trap line, and the one that separated the greenhorn from the old hand. It was nothing more than a wooden frame strung with window screen, or a square of hardware cloth, small enough to carry flat against the bottom of a pack. But in the right hands, it was the difference between an empty set and a fox on the stake. A red fox reads the ground the way a man reads a newspaper. One clod of frozen dirt, one clumsy fingerprint pressed into the soil above a buried trap, and he steps around it and trots on. The sifter erased all of that. A trapper would kneel over his dirt hole set, hold the screen a few inches above the pan, and shake fine, loose earth down until the steel disappeared under a coat as smooth as sifted flour. Old-timers recall sifting a coffee can full of dry dirt back in October when the ground was still soft, and hauling it along all winter so their sets never froze into lumps. It cost pennies to build and lasted for decades. Diaries from the northern lines describe a father teaching his boy to sift by ear as much as by eye, listening for the soft hiss of fine soil against the rattle of grit that would betray a set. When factory-made waxed dirt and pre-screened trapping soil arrived in plastic sacks, the homemade sieve was quietly retired. Convenience won again. But the men who still sift by hand will tell you the machine never learned the wrist flick that made a set truly invisible, and that a whole winter's catch could rise or fall on this one forgotten scrap of screen and wood. Number 14, the trapping trowel carved out the beating heart of every land set, and no woodsman worth his salt walked the line without one. Store-bought garden trowels were too wide and too shallow, so trappers filed their own down narrow, sometimes forging a slim blade from an old file or the leaf of a broken spring. The tool bit into frozen November ground where a shovel would only skid, digging the tight, deep dirt hole that fooled a coyote into thinking a rodent had denned there. A good trowel cost less than 50 cents at the general store, and a homemade one cost nothing but an evening at the forge. The work was precise and cold. A trapper knelt on a scrap of canvas to keep his knee scent off the ground, chipped out a hole at the base of a grass clump or cow chip, and set his trap 2 fingers back from the opening. Diaries from the northern lines describe hands so numb by noon that men warmed the trowel handle in their armpits between sets. When bulk trappers switched to power augers and lightweight aluminum tools, the old forged trowel slipped into the junk drawer. Yet those blades outlasted their makers, passed from father to son. Each nick in the steel a memory of a hard winter survived. Number 13, the Grapnel drag and cross stake solved a problem that plain stakes never could, and old trappers swore by it for the wariest animals. A big fox or a bobcat caught on a solid stake will fight against a fixed point, twisting until the jaws work loose or the skin tears. So the woodsman gave the animal something to fight against that fought back gently. A grapnel drag was a heavy iron hook, sometimes 3-pronged like a small anchor, chained to the trap and buried loose beside it. When the animal pulled, the drag came free and tangled itself in the first brush pile, holding fast without the sudden violence that ripped a foot loose. The cross stake was its cousin, 2 stakes driven at opposing angles deep into the earth, crossing beneath the surface so no amount of pulling could lever them out. A blacksmith would forge a grapnel for $1 or trade it for a mink hide. Line records from the 1930s note that a properly dragged set held 9 catches in 10, while a poorly staked one lost the smartest animals every time. When lightweight cable stakes and earth anchors came along, the heavy iron grapnel was left rusting in the barn. But the principle it taught, let the animal wear itself out slow, is knowledge. Most modern trappers never learned. Number 12. The pack basket rode the backs of American woodsmen from the Adirondacks to the Cascades, and it carried a man's whole living on his shoulders. Woven from thin strips of black ash pounded off the log, Until the growth rings separated, the basket was light, tough, and shaped to sit high and square against the spine. It held everything: a dozen traps stacked jaw to jaw, a hatchet, bait tins, wire, lure bottles wrapped in rag, and by evening, a raccoon or two lashed across the top. A good ash basket from a North Country maker cost around $3 in 1940. A serious sum, but it lasted a lifetime and then some. The weave breathed, so it never soured the way a canvas sack did, and a trapper could set it down in the snow and kneel to make his set without unslinging a tangle of gear. Oral histories from Maine and upstate New York recall boys learning the trap line by carrying the basket while their fathers set the traps, promoted to the steel only when their shoulders could bear the load a full day. When cheap nylon packs and plastic totes flooded the market, the black ash basket became a decoration hung on cabin walls. A well-made basket became a family heirloom, its ash strips darkening with the oils of a working hand, some of them handed down through 3 generations of trappers who each added their own repairs to the weave. The basket makers grew old. The ash trees fell to blight, and a craft older than the country itself thinned to a handful of stubborn weavers, keeping the memory alive. Number 11. Trap wax was the quiet secret behind every trapper who caught fur while his neighbors caught nothing. Bare steel rusts, and rust smells of iron and blood to a fox's nose, warning him off from 10 feet away. Rust also grips grit and grabs the ground, slowing the snap that a fast animal can beat. So the woodsman boiled his traps and then dipped them in wax. A block of paraffin or beeswax cost a dime, and a pound of it treated a whole line. The trapper would heat a kettle of water until a thin skin of melted wax floated on top, then lower each clean, dyed trap through that film so it came out sheathed in a coat thinner than paper. The wax sealed the steel against rust, killed the metal scent under the smell of the woods, and made the jaws snap shut a hair faster on a frost-stiff morning. Old line journals describe waxing traps by lantern light in the woodshed, the sweet hot smell filling the little room. Some men added a shaving of pine pitch or fir needles to the pot, so the traps carried a natural forest scent right into the ground. When commercial dip and wax products arrived in a single can, the 2-kettle ritual faded. But the trappers who still wax by hand will tell you a store can never match the patience of a man who does it right. Number 10, the dye kettle turned bright, factory new steel into something a wild animal would walk over without a second glance. A shiny trap flashes in the sun and reeks of the factory, oil, machine grease, human handling. Every one of those signals spells danger to a creature that has survived by suspicion. So the woodsman boiled his traps in a big iron kettle full of bark. The classic dye was made from logwood chips, sold cheap at the druggist, or from black walnut hulls gathered by the bushel in autumn and let to rot until they stained everything they touched. A trapper would fill the kettle, drop in his traps, and simmer them for an hour until the steel came out a deep, even brown-black, the color of wet earth and dead leaves. The tannin in the bark actually bonded to the metal, laying down a coat that fought rust and swallowed scent in one step. Walnut hulls cost nothing but the stooping to gather them, and a sack of logwood ran a quarter. Line accounts from the Ohio Valley recall whole families gathering around the boiling kettle in October, hands stained black to the wrist for a week after. When aluminum traps and factory-coated steel made dyeing seem old-fashioned, the smoking kettle went cold. Yet the deep brown of a properly dyed trap remains, to those who knew it, the true color of a season about to begin. Number 9. The fleshing beam and draw knife stood in every fur shed in America, and the sound of steel scraping hide was the sound of money being made. A green pelt straight off the animal carries a layer of fat and meat on the inside that will rot the fur if it is left on. Getting it off clean without cutting the skin was the skill that decided whether a hide graded prime or got docked to nothing at the buyer's table. The beam was a smooth, rounded plank, often a split log sanded slick, propped at an angle against the wall. The trapper draped the wet pelt over it, leaned his weight against the top edge, and pushed a dull draw knife or a fleshing tool down the hide in long, even strokes, peeling the fat away in curling ribbons. A homemade beam cost nothing, and a fleshing knife could be had for under $1. Old fur men recall the ache between the shoulders after a night of fleshing 40 muskrats, the smell of the shed, the grease slicking the beam until it shone. A skilled hand could flesh a rat in under a minute and never nick the leather. The best beams were kept oiled and smooth as glass, some of them the same split log a grandfather had leaned over half a century before, worn to a shine by thousands of pelts. When tanneries began buying whole carcasses and modern trappers shipped fur unhandled, the beam leaned unused in the corner. But the men who fleshed their own knew that a clean hide told the buyer everything about the man who ran the line, and that the difference between a season's profit and a season's loss was measured in the sweep of a draw knife. Number 8. The fur stretcher shaped a limp, greasy pelt into the taut, handsome fur that brought top dollar, and no set of tools on this list did more to fill a wallet. A hide left to dry in a wad is worth almost nothing. Stretched properly, the same hide grades prime. Trappers used two kinds. The wire stretcher was a springy loop of heavy fence wire bent to the shape of a mink or muskrat, slipped inside the cased hide so the tension pulled the skin tight and let air reach every inch. The wooden stretcher was a smooth, tapered board, whittled to the exact size the fur buyer wanted, over which the pelt was drawn fur side in and pinned to cure. A bundle of wire stretchers cost about $1 for a dozen. A good set of graded boards was a winter's project by the stove. Old journals note that a buyer could spot a lazy man's fur across the room, loose, wrinkled, poorly sized, and pay him half. Boys learned the standard shapes by heart, because a muskrat stretched an inch too wide, split at the belly, and lost its grade. When fur prices collapsed and green hide buying took over, attics filled with hundreds of these boards, each notch and taper a lesson in a trade that once clothed the nation. Number 7. The wire snare was the cheapest catcher a woodsman ever carried, and pound for pound the most effective, which is exactly why the law came for it. A snare was nothing but a loop of light cable or brass picture wire fitted with a small locking slide, hung in a trail or a den mouth where an animal pushed its head through and drew the noose tight behind it. A whole winter's worth of snare wire cost less than $1, and a man could carry 100 snares in his coat pocket where 100 steel traps would have needed a wagon. That was the snare's power and its curse. It was so cheap and so deadly that a single trapper could blanket a valley, and it did not care what walked into it. Old accounts from the mountain country described running 100 rabbit and fox snares before breakfast, the wire singing faintly in the cold. But because the snare caught everything and asked nothing of skill, states began writing it out of the law books through the middle of the century, restricting where and how it could be used. Whole regions where snaring had fed families for generations saw the practice outlawed almost overnight. The knowledge of how to read a trail, size a loop, and hang it at the right height thinned with each passing season, until a tool older than the frontier itself became something spoken of in whispers. Number 6. The spring pole snare married the wire snare to a bent sapling, and it was so quietly lethal that it vanished under a wave of regulation faster than almost any tool here. The idea was ancient and elegant. A trapper bent a young springy tree down against its will, held it under tension with a simple trigger, and rigged a snare loop at the trail. When an animal took the loop, it sprang the trigger. The sapling whipped upright, and the catch was lifted clear off the ground in an instant, beyond the reach of scavengers. Quick and certain. It cost a man nothing but wire and a jackknife and the eye to pick the right tree. Old woodsmen recall setting a twitch up along a rabbit run at dusk and finding supper hanging head high by morning. The spring pole needed no steel, no bait, sometimes only an understanding of where creatures traveled and how a bent tree stored its strength. That very efficiency doomed it. As game laws tightened through the 1940s and 50s, the spring pole was singled out and banned across much of the country, judged too effective to allow. The men who could still read a sapling's spring and set a silent trigger grew old, and a skill that had put meat on frontier tables for 2 centuries slipped almost entirely out of living memory. Number 5. The Castoreum lure bottle was the trapper's magic, the small corked vial that could pull a beaver or a mink from clear across a marsh. Castoreum is the musk a beaver lays down to mark its territory, harvested from glands the size of a plum, and to another beaver, it is a message that cannot be ignored. Mixed with a few drops of other gland scents and a little glycerin to hold it, aged for months in a cool cellar until it ripened, it became the most powerful lure a woodsman owned. A single ounce of good Castoreum traded for real money, $1 or more, when a whole beaver hide brought only a few, and trappers guarded their recipes the way a cook guards a prize pie. The bottle rode wrapped in rag at the bottom of the pack, and a single drop dabbed on a stick above a set drew animals that no bait could reach, working on their instinct rather than their hunger. Old linemen recall the smell clinging to their hands for a week, sharp and sweet and unmistakable. Every trapper mixed his own, adjusting it by feel and season, passing the formula down like a family secret. When commercial lures arrived in uniform little jars, mass mixed and mild, the homemade art faded. Some trappers kept a mother batch going for years, adding to it each season the way a baker keeps a sourdough starter, until the scent carried the memory of a dozen winters in a single drop. Yet the men who aged their own Castoreum knew that no factory ever bottled the patience it took to make scent that truly called the wild in. Number 4. The muskrat spear turned the frozen marshes of the Louisiana coast and the northern lakes into a harvest, and it was a tool most Americans today would not even recognize. When ice locked the water and steel traps grew hard to set, the marsh trapper took up a long-handled spear tipped with a cluster of barbed prongs. He would find a muskrat's push-up, the little dome of mud and reed the animal built over a breathing hole, and drive the spear down through it, feeling for the soft resistance of fur below. It was work that demanded a feel developed over years, reading the marsh through the shaft of a pole, knowing a live house from an empty one by the give of the mud. A good spear cost a couple of dollars from a marsh country blacksmith and lasted a lifetime of winters. In the coastal parishes, whole families worked the rats this way, poling flat pirogues through the reeds from dark to dark, and a single trapper might take dozens in a day. Oral histories from the marsh country recall the ache of the shoulders, the cold water wicking up the pole, the pride in a full boat by dusk. When fur prices fell and the marshes were drained or leased away, the spear was set aside. In the coldest years, whole coastal communities lived and died by the winter rat harvest, the spear as central to their survival as the plow was to a farmer's. The men who could read a push-up by feel are nearly all gone, and with them a way of life that turned frozen swamp into a living. Number 3. The figure 4 deadfall required no steel at all, only 3 whittled sticks and a heavy rock, and it was the purest test of woodcraft on the whole trap line. The deadfall was ancient, older than the country, older than the fur trade, a trap a man could build from what lay at his feet. 3 sticks were notched to lock together in the shape of a figure 4, one upright, one diagonal, one baited trigger balanced so delicately that the lightest touch collapsed the whole works and dropped a weighted log or flat stone on whatever reached for the bait. The genius was that it cost nothing and left no metal scent, and a woodsman stranded without gear could still eat. But the balance was everything. Notch the trigger a hair too deep and it never fired, a hair too shallow and it fell at the first breeze. Old woodsmen recall a boy spending a whole afternoon by the woodpile whittling triggers until his father judged one worthy of the line. Mastering the figure 4 was a rite of passage, proof that a young man could survive on knowledge alone. When cheap steel traps became available in every hardware store, the deadfall was abandoned as too much trouble. And with it went the deepest skill of the American woodsman, the ability to walk into the timber with empty hands and come out fed. Number 2, the drowning wire was the humane secret of the water trapper, the quiet rig that ended a catch cleanly and kept the fur perfect. And it took a real understanding of an animal to build. A muskrat or a mink caught in shallow water will fight and twist, wringing the fur, sometimes tearing free. So the woodsman ran a wire from the bank, down into deep water, weighted at the bottom with a rock or a heavy sinker, and fitted it with a simple one-way slide lock that let the trap chain travel down but never back up. When the animal was caught, its own struggle carried it into deep water. the slide locked, and the end came fast and sure. It cost a few cents of wire and a lead weight, and it spared the trapper the cruelty of a long-held animal and the buyer the sight of damaged fur. Old line journals describe rigging drowning wires along a whole slough before the season, testing each slide by hand to be sure it ran free one way and held the other. It demanded that a man understand exactly how the animal would move once caught, where it would run, how deep it would go. When body gripping traps made the water set simpler, the drowning wire and its clever slide lock quietly disappeared. Yet the men who ran them will tell you it was the mark of a thoughtful trapper, one who understood the creature he pursued. Number 1. The Newhouse steel trap crowned every trap line in America, and its story is stranger than any fiction. This was the trap, the standard by which all others were measured, stamped with the name Newhouse and the size of the jaw, from the little number 0 for weasel and rat to the mighty number 5 that could hold a bear. Sewell Newhouse began forging his traps by hand in the early 1800s, and the design was so perfect that it barely changed for 100 years. But here's the part that sounds made up. The traps were made by the Oneida community, a religious commune in upstate New York that shared everything in common and believed in a new way of living. Trap making became the fortune that funded their whole experiment. Thousands upon thousands of Newhouse traps shipped across the frontier, arming the men who opened the West. When the community broke apart, the company they left behind went on to become famous for silverware, of all things. A table full of forks born from a factory of bear traps. A Newhouse trap cost around $1 for the common sizes, a real investment, but it was forged to outlast the man who bought it. And hides still hang today on traps that caught fur before the Civil War. Old trappers speak the name Newhouse with something close to reverence, the way a carpenter speaks of an old and honest tool. Each size had its purpose burned into memory. The number 1 for muskrat, the number 1.5 for fox, the number 3 for beaver and coyote, the great number 4 for wolf, and a boy learned them the way he learned his letters. The traps came packed in wooden crates with a printed guide that Newhouse himself had a hand in, a book that taught a generation of frontiersmen not just which trap to buy, but how to think like the animal they hunted. When cheaper stamped traps flooded the market and the great fur days waned, the Newhouse line finally ended. But every steel trap made since is only a copy of what one blacksmith and a community of dreamers perfected in a barn in New York. From the humble dirt sifter to the legendary Newhouse trap, these 15 tools built the American woodsman and vanished with him. They were more than iron and ash and wire. They were knowledge, how to read the ground, bend a sapling, mix a scent, and take a living from the wild with your own 2 hands. Most of it is gone now, traded for convenience and shrink wrap. So here's my challenge. Which one surprised you most? Tell me in the comments whether your grandfather ran a Newhouse line or speared rats in a frozen marsh, because that knowledge deserves to be remembered. It nearly was forgotten, now you know.